The 1919 steel strike was one of the biggest labor conflicts in U.S. history. Over 350,000 workers walked off the job, demanding shorter hours, better pay, and the right to unionize. But instead of negotiation, they were met with violence. Newspapers called them radicals, police broke up demonstrations, and thousands of workers, many of them immigrants, were beaten, jailed, or fired. This wasn't just a political or economic issue, it was a moral one. It forced Americans, and especially American Catholics, to ask, can you claim to value human dignity while ignoring the people who build your world? That question became the foundation for one of the most radical faith-based movements in U.S. history. The Catholic worker movement exemplified how American Catholics, influenced by social teaching and labor unrest, like the 1919 steel strike, actively transformed faith into social action, showing that religious belief could be a driving force for labor rights, economic justice, and systemic reform. In the early 1900s, industrial America ran on cheap labor. Workers, especially immigrants, faced brutal hours, dangerous conditions, and little protection. The steel strike wasn't an isolated event. It was a symptom of something much bigger. Corporations controlled the economy, and the government often sided with business interests over human ones. For many Catholic immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe, this felt like a betrayal of both American and Christian values. They went to Mass on Sunday and heard about human dignity, then returned to work Monday to be treated like machines. That disconnect sparked something inside the church itself. Catholic leaders began developing what became known as Catholic social teaching, a set of ideas about how faith should shape economic and social life. It started in 1891 with Rerum Novarum, an encyclical by Pope Leo XIII. It defended the rights of workers to unionize and called for fair wages and condemned both extreme capitalism and socialism. Leo XIII wrote that labor wasn't just a commodity, it was part of a human dignity, a way to share in God's creation. 4 decades later, in Quadragesimo Anno, Pope Pius XI expanded that message, warning against both corporate greed and totalitarian states. He emphasized the need for justice, solidarity, and what he called subsidiarity. The social problems should be solved at the most local level possible. In America, the U.S. bishops responded with their program of social reconstruction in 1919, calling for public housing, minimum wages, and worker protections. It was basically a Catholic version of the New Deal, years before the New Deal even existed. So by the 1930s, there was already a strong moral foundation for labor reform within the church. But it took 2 people, Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, to turn those ideas into a movement. Dorothy Day didn't start out as a religious activist. Before her conversion, she was a journalist, a social reformer, and part of the radical left in New York. She had seen poverty up close and felt deeply connected to the struggles of the working people. But she also longed for spiritual meaning, something beyond politics. In 1927, she converted to Catholicism. For her, faith didn't replace activism, it gave it purpose. She later wrote that she wanted to live out the Gospels in the streets, not just in the pews. Around this time, she met Peter Maurin, a French immigrant and former Christian brother, who had his own radical ideas. Maurin believed that society needed to return to small-scale community living, what he called a green revolution. He wrote short, poetic essays, later collected as easy essays, that called for houses of hospitality, communal farms, and a new kind of Catholic social order, built on personal responsibility and voluntary poverty. Together in 1933, Day and Maurin founded the Catholic Worker newspaper, launched on May Day, the International Labor Holiday. It sold for a penny a copy and combined theology, social commentary, and practical guidance. But it wasn't just a paper, it was a movement. The first House of Hospitality opened in New York that same year, offering food and shelter to the unemployed during the Great Depression. Soon, similar houses appeared in other cities. Their approach was simple, but revolutionary. Live with the poor, serve them directly, and challenge the systems that created poverty in the first place. As historian William Miller put it, the Catholic worker wasn't a charity, it was a protest in the form of love. The Catholic worker movement blurred the line between theology and activism. It wasn't about preaching from a distance, it was about living the message of the Gospels every day. They built houses of hospitality to feed and shelter those in need. They started agrarian communes, small rural communities inspired by Morin's vision of simplicity and shared labor. And through their newspaper, they gave a voice to those left out of mainstream society. Day and Morin believed that you couldn't separate spiritual life from social justice. True Christianity, they argued, meant pacifism, voluntary poverty, and solidarity with the marginalized. Dorothy Day became one of the most consistent pacifists of her time. She opposed every war the U.S. fought during her lifetime, including World War II and Vietnam. As historian Anne Clement notes in her essay, The Spirituality of Dorothy Day's Pacifism, Day saw peace not as an abstract idea, but as something rooted in daily acts of mercy and community. To her, feeding the hungry and refusing to kill were part of the same moral vision. Even though the Catholic worker movement wasn't a union, it stood firmly with the workers. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Dorothy Day and other members supported strikes, wrote about local labor disputes, and provided aid to families affected by them. Their support connected directly to the same moral values at the heart of the 1919 steel strike: dignity, justice, and resistance to exploitation. But instead of framing those ideas through class struggle or political ideology, the Catholic worker expressed them through faith. They drew from the same documents that had guided earlier Catholic labor reform: Rerum Novarum, Quadragesimo Anno, and the Bishop's Program of Social Reconstruction. The movement became a living continuation of Catholic social teaching, putting it into practice through real people and real suffering. As historian Thomas Schatz writes in American Labor and the Catholic Church, the Catholic worker offered something different: a moral critique of capitalism that didn't abandon religion or compassion. It asked people to see labor not just as an economic issue, but as a question of love and justice. The legacy of the Catholic worker movement is still visible today. Dorothy Day's work influenced later Catholic social thought, including the writings of Pope John XXIII and Mater et Magistra in Pacem in Terris, which both emphasized the moral duty to promote peace and social engagement. In the 1960s and 70s, the same spirit inspired liberation theology in Latin America, a movement that also saw faith as a tool for justice and the poor, as central to the gospel message. Even today, Catholic worker houses continue to operate across the country, offering meals, shelter, and community to anyone in need. The movement remains small but powerful, a reminder that living one's faith can mean more than prayer. It can mean protest, compassion, and sacrifice. Dorothy Day once said, "Our problems stem from our acceptance of this filthy, rotten system." She didn't mean that as despair. She meant it as a challenge. To her, faith wasn't about escaping the world. It was about transforming it. The Catholic worker movement began as a small act of conscience in the middle of the Great Depression, but it grew into something much larger. A reminder that faith, when taken seriously, can shake the foundations of society. In a time of greed and division, Dorothy Day and Peter Morin showed that holiness could look like handing out soup, marching for peace, or standing beside a picket line. Their story is proof that religion doesn't have to justify power, it can challenge it.